Hi, I'm Aidan Brown, and this is the Main Stage podcast. And we are joined here today by executive producer Ben Matjiu and by one of South Africa's favorite wise elders, Professor William Gumede. Welcome to the show, Prof.
No, good morning. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this conversation.
It's so fantastic to have you. It's actually the second time that I've been fortunate enough to interview you. The other one was over a recent book, which I think is quite fantastic. But we'll ignore that for today. There's a whole bunch of questions that South Africans would like answers to, and it's quite difficult to access public intellectuals like you. We've had a couple of people like Professor Torbega and Komo who've also been very kind from WITS and given us a little bit of time, and we'll just hop straight into it. You recently wrote an article on Black economic empowerment in South Africa, and it stirred or ruffled up quite a lot of feathers. It had a lot of support, and it also had a lot of people that were detractees. I would say personally that Black economic empowerment has failed in South Africa, and that all it has done is that it has created a class of oligarchs in South Africa, similar to what we have in Russia. I call them the South African oligarchs. Sometimes they are referred to as people of the ANC patronage network. Do you think that my assessment on the creation of an oligarch class by the ANC system is a little bit of an exaggeration, or do you think there's some merit to my argument?
You know, in the early 90s, when the ANC put together the strategy of Black economic empowerment, it all looked very, very good, sound very sensible. I mean, the idea was that it would be important after the apartheid, when blacks had been marginalized, they couldn't own businesses in the mainstream, couldn't own property, mainstream property, and so on. That it would be very, very important to stabilize South Africa, to create two types of classes. One was middle class, to have a very broad black middle class. Now, black or rather middle classes are very, very important in societies, yes, because they're a stabilizing force. And if societies don't have a large enough middle class, it makes those societies unstable. And the middle class also fuel economic growth and the economy.
Yes.
And many developing countries, including many African countries, have failed to prosper because they were unable to build a broad-based middle class, and so on. So that, you know, it is a very, very good strategy to have.
Yes.
But then the second part of the strategy is that societies also need businesses, a business class. What I mean by business class is people who own and who start businesses. That's very, very important.
An entrepreneurial spirit.
Absolutely, yeah. Entrepreneurial class, maybe is a better way to describe it. And again, one of the reasons why many countries have failed, particularly African countries after the end of colonialism and so on, is that one, they couldn't create a broad-based middle class. Number two, they could not also create an entrepreneurial class. And so on. So the Black economic empowerment in our case, one could say it was an attempt to create an entrepreneurial or a business class. So all very good.
To some extent, it did work up until more or less the end of Mbeki's time. So there was a time where South Africa was creating, especially a growing black middle class. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So I think the thing that's where did it go wrong? It actually went wrong quite early on already. So when a society wants to create an entrepreneurial class or a business class, the society will have to create it with people with skin in the game. So people who already are business people, people who are already entrepreneurs now. Because, you know, you cannot pull anyone from anywhere in the township and just turn that person into an entrepreneur. And so that really is the first thing. You go and look for your entrepreneurs and you back them. It's like you pick your winners,
Yes.
but they have to be already entrepreneurs. It's like farmers. If you want to build a farming class, you can't go pull somebody out of the towns who's never farmed. And you go find people who are already farming, and then you support them. So the problem with Black economic empowerment, is almost at the starting blocks where it failed, is that the ANC empowered politicians.
Yes.
So you imagine to create a business class out of politicians who've never started any business in their life before, had no interest in business, and had absolutely no skin in the game. I mean, that was an absolute flaw, and that actually, sadly, was not new in the African context. I did a report in the early 2000s for the Economist Intelligence Unit, special report on Black economic empowerment, looking at the history in Africa of empowerment programs. And many African countries introduced empowerment programs almost immediately after colonialism, and they made the same flawed mistake of empowering politicians of the liberation movement or of the independence movement. So they did not pick winners who were entrepreneurs already. So coming back to that, is an absolutely fatal flaw. I mean, if you look at all the people early on who benefited, the likes of Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now the president, the likes of Tokyo Sequale, and so on. So these are all politicians, ANC politicians. Yes. So essentially what that changed the game is that it then became an empowerment of politicians. I call them political capitalists. Yes. Now, for me, there's an extraordinary fact, and in 1995, and I had a column in the Star newspaper at that time, and I wrote a piece, because if you go back to 1995, the sort of early days of Black economic empowerment, and it all looked very exciting and it all looked very good.
And I were in primary school.
You were in school.
We were in primary school, not just school. We were in the early years of primary school.
But I quoted a report which I had stumbled on at a time. So a report that came out in 1990 in the old apartheid era. The then finance department in 1990 came up with a report. They had done a survey at the time looking at how many black businesses were in South Africa. So this is now in 1990. This is before, still during the apartheid era, and that survey showed that there were 5 million black business people. So obviously not sort of big, giant, sort of tycoon-likes, but when I say business, from small to medium-sized businesses, you own a butchery, sort of a taxi business, and so on.
Each one of them employs 1 or 2 people. That's quite a significant employment.
With skin in the game.
Yes.
And now you have to imagine, and I thought about, that column at a time, and I would imagine, they were successful during the apartheid era when it was very, very difficult. They were successful. Now, were our entrepreneurs. Yes. So an empowerment program, if it was to be successful, had to empower those people to say, well, how do we now take you from where you are to the next level?
Yes.
How do we give you access to finance now, which you didn't get during apartheid? How do we get you access to opportunities and so on?
Yes.
Now, but the problem was there is that the ANC is a liberation movement. It's ideology. So African liberation movements have ideology. So their ideology is against business. They don't really believe in business or entrepreneurship.
Yeah. For them, the state hands out everything.
Absolutely. So they believe in the state. And secondly, they were, in the 1970s and 1980s, the ANC were actively anti-business, including anti-black business. So if you were a black business person in the 1980s or 1970s, you were viewed with suspicions. If you were successful, there would be questions. Say, why are you successful? There's stuff out there. You must be in some kind of alignment with your party government.
Yes.
So often during protests, and even my times when I was a youth in the 80s, during protests, people also attacked black business.
Yes,
in the community and so on, and black business would be casted as bad people, not as good people. So the ANC did not want to empower that group of people because they were suspicious. That's the first thing here. So really, really massive mistake, because you cannot build a business class without business people. And here where you're 5 million, think about it, 5 million people.
Yes.
or beyond, more in 1994, ready to be empowered, skin of the game, survive a party, they can do business.
I believe that it really suited the ANC historically and now to not have an entrepreneurial class of black people or of any people in South Africa. Because when you have entrepreneurs and small people that are working for themselves and empowering themselves, they tend to be apolitical. They tend to be less open to political manipulation because they're busy. They're doing their own things. They're more concerned about the government providing basic services and then being hands-off so they can run their little businesses and live their lives in peace and freedom. And what the ANC has done, instead of creating this apolitical entrepreneurial class of citizens in South Africa, they've made a large portion of BA sociology and political science students. I know I was a 4-year BA politics student, BSOC politics student. I know you're obviously a professor in one of those departments. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves and say to some extent that suited the ANC. Because they have a whole lot of unemployed Marxists, essentially people that are Marxist swayed, that are out there in society, are unemployed, are disempowered, and as a result, more prone to political manipulation. But again, I don't think this has been done on purpose. I think this is just the way it's ended up. But it does suit the ANC to have voters that are more interested in the handout from the government than in getting their support for their little business.
I have a different view in terms of, I think once the ANC was on that, first the ANC's hostility to business.
Yes.
Number one. And it's not just hostility, it's ideological hostility.
Yes.
And that's been a problem because, again, countries cannot develop and become prosperous out of poverty unless they are pragmatic, unless they adopt pragmatic policies, because the moment countries adopt ideological policies, I mean, that really is the road to ruin. And that's been the ANC in this liberation ideology. And part of that ideology that was so wrong in the empowerment space was the idea was, look, we don't trust business, whether they are white or black. We don't trust black business either, unless they lock into the ANC or linked to the ANC. Let's create our own people. It was also the ANC's model. The ANC has a philosophy called the National Democratic Revolution. And in that ideology, the ANC has to argues it will take control of every part of society. So the state, business, markets, professional bodies.
That's the one that Anthea Jeffries always talks about.
And so on. So that is the NDR. Now, so total control of every part of society. And in business, to create a real business class in any society, you have to get the entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs are very unlikely going to be supporters of the party line. I mean, entrepreneurs are mavericks.
Yes.
You go out there, you lose everything, and you stand up again, and you kind of...
and entrepreneurs usually resist state control, centralization. Because usually centralization of powers, like we have in South Africa with all the extra legislation and red tape and that kind of thing, it makes it difficult to do business. Yeah. So entrepreneurs are sometimes resistant in a way.
So the second part also of about entrepreneurs is that, or rather by the ANC, if they do not, as a party, want a challenge to their political power. So, or parallel powers in a society. Because if you have a national democratic revolution and you want to be in control of the whole society or part of society, you don't want independent people, independent powers. And because if you are an entrepreneur and you do very, very well without the state's help, the state support or the party support, you're totally independent, you have independent power. You have independent power in society also. So, and that's the other fundamental thing. And that's also the sad part. And I'll come back to you on, apologies, on the report, which I did for the Economist Intelligence Unit in the early 2000s, looking at African independence movements when they came to power, and how they actually almost deliberately did not want to create independent, powerful entrepreneurial class at all, because they did not want to have alternative or opposition to the political power, their political power. So they would rather empower their own people who are not business people, but who are.
And I guess that's what drove cadre deployment in the end. Or one of the driving principles of cadre deployment.
Yeah, so the answer is cadre deployment policy is actually a driving force for that. The policy is of the ANC, which is actually one of the reasons why our state has collapsed or close to collapse.
I completely agree.
Totally, and so on, because cadre deployment means you appoint your people into positions in governments that are only part of your party and even your little group, but it's even much more destructive than that. It's the last couple of years. Cadre deployment also has meant that the ANC has also forced business that do business with the state to have their cadres in those companies.
Yes.
So I mean that is very destructive. For example, we've seen the last couple of years that many former cabinet members join business, either as CEOs or as chairing companies. I mean that is just absolutely appalling. Not also for the businesses itself, because
it's a revolving door problem that we have in South Africa, and sometimes I see it even with business schools, elite business schools, for example, where one day there's a guy, he's at an elite business school, or let's say he's got a nice position at a university, he's lecturing or whatever it is, and then the next month he's in government, he's a deputy minister or minister, and then a couple of years later he's on a board of big business. And I think that this is a very destructive thing that we have in South Africa. Just as an example, I think that we had a lot of business leaders during the state capture era that should have been much more vocal against state capture. But because they had a lot of these business leaders, because they had a lot of direct connections to politics, they didn't speak out. They were very quiet. They just towed the line, and they were very hush. I saw it with NHI. None of the big business leaders in the healthcare space, guys like Adrian Gore, I mean, they didn't say anything. They just turned around and they said, oh, NHI, this and that. Now it's on their doorstep. Now they're really panicking. But at the time, they ushered it in and they said, no, it won't be a problem. And they just pandered. And I think it is that closeness to politics that causes an issue.
I mean, one of the things is that, when you have politicians, but politicians also that comes out of a liberation, this ideology of the ANC, right? If it's the state, there's a certain way of doing things. Now they go into private sector, or they are deployed into the public sector, because they have to use that word. They don't
make their way up the ranks.
Yeah. They are deployed and they were mates.
Parachute.
And often what happens, because companies want, if you're a mining company, you want to renew your mining license, and it is to do with politics. So a lot of companies then appoint, say, a senior ANC person. Once they have their person will then do all the negotiations and get the license.
Which killed the mining sector to some extent.
And if you're another kind of company, we get big contracts from the state, do the similar. Now the problem with that is, it all looks from a business point of view, we think, oh well, actually we've appointed this person and now we got our deal. But what it does is, firstly, it encourages sort of crony capitalism. That's the first thing, You just start off that. So makes the system corrupt and non-meritocratic. Because all then you need is, if you're a business and you want to get your government license or you want to get a government contract, you get your influential ANC person, you put that person on your board and into your executive, you're going to get it. So even if your company perhaps is not doing a good job, you can get your contract because you have this person. So what it means for other people who are actually better, companies that are better in the market, but they're honest and they don't want to get engaged in this sort of patronage type of politics, they're excluded totally. So we then destroy entrepreneurship, destroy genuine entrepreneurship. That's the first thing. But the second thing is also when the ANC cadre is a certain kind of person. So you bring the ANC's culture, the sort of toxic ANC culture, into your business.
Yes.
And that becomes a problem, and then it destroys that business actually over the long term. I mean, if you just look, I mean, if you Google, sorry, I used the word Google, if you just search and you see the sort of corporate fights the last couple of years in the country, it's always involved often an ANC cadre who was deployed as a chair or the CEO of a company and then brought the ANC's politics in there. So because the ANC has been so factionalized, all of those ANC politics then become part of a company. And the thing is with many of these politicians, say like you appoint now former cabinet minister, ANC cabinet minister as a chair of a private company, often, sadly, these individuals, they often think that they know everything.
Yes.
And so on. You can't challenge them. So, say if you're CEO, for example, can't challenge, you can't, these people's views are the law, because that's a liberation culture. The leader's views are law, and you have to be uncritical. You're loyal uncritically. What it means in a business, a business in a market can't operate that way. You have to listen to the people on the ground. You have to listen to evidence. You have to listen to expertise. You can't listen to ideology if you want to run a business. I mean, are you going to make a profit? Are you going to run a business properly if you're going to run it on ideology? So you have all of these people who are making decisions based on ideology, and also people who would just fire people who disagree with them.
Yes.
So it brings toxic cultures inside our businesses. So the ANC's party culture, for me, sadly, has moved into big corporates because ANC people have been deployed to the corporates. Now, countries have corporate cultures. Like almost every country has a certain way of doing things.
Of course, yeah.
But countries also have political cultures. So because the ANC, the liberation movement, has been so dominant, and because it has this ideology of a national democratic revolution that they control every part of society becomes like the ANC.
Yes, the ANC has managed to permeate its socialist, communist ideology into almost every space imaginable. And even though they advertise themselves as a pro-democratic institution towards the breakdown of the apartheid era, that was obviously good PR, but in the end they've driven that socialist communist narrative. But I think that era of true communist ideologues that existed in the ANC, I think that they're a dying breed, that they're dying out, and the next generation coming up is a Gucci, what I call a Gucci communist. They don't actually have that true ideology like the previous generation did. They're a lot more open to corruption. They're a lot more open to bribery and to dubious acts. Having said that ideology, not only has it been bad for business and for entrepreneurial growth, like you describe now, in the end, that ideology has left the ANC increasingly isolated politically over the last couple of decades. We've certainly seen that ideology leave the ANC geopolitically isolated in the last couple of years. I don't want to talk about the merits of Israel and Palestine, but I will say that Israel, or the ANC's relationship with the Israel-Palestine conflict has left them geopolitically isolated. Their views on empowerment laws and that kind of thing has left them increasingly isolated, and it seems to be tearing the ANC apart from the inside. There seems to be internal ideological rifts that can't be overcome anymore. And in the build-up to the 2026 and 2029 elections, do you think the ANC will be able to overcome its own ideological pitfalls? Yeah.
Let me just maybe one last thing just on the empowerment, as you were saying, in terms of so I think people do not understand, or many people do not understand how widespread BE policy is in the market. So here there's let me say 3 levels. The one is if you want to get a government contract, so BE in government, right, in government contracts. If you want to get a government contract, these days. Be very, very difficult if you are not empowerment. So if you don't have your ANCB partner, you know, your political capitalist, right? That's the first start off. Now, let me just tell you, if you think about the government procurement bill, budget every year, it's about 19-20% of the overall budget. In a typical year, let's say 2017, let's just use that because that came up in the Zondo Commission. That budget was 800 billion for the year. Now, just think about it. This is BE procurement. Like, you can't get a contract. You must just imagine now, like, the kind of money.
It's ring fenced.
So, but and there's obviously more now. So, and what people also often do not understand is that actually most of government services are delivered through contracts. There's only a few national departments that deliver services, like Home Affairs, the police, and defense, that actually deliver services. The rest, actually, services are out contracted
private sector.
To the private sector. And so if you look, I imagine, so that's the first. So if you now get deployed companies, political capitalists who never run a company, some people set up companies just to get a contract.
Of course.
Or they go find another partner.
They set up 5 in a day, all in the same serial number.
And that's actually one reason why we have state failure. So if people just can understand that it's the majority of our government services, public services are delivered by companies, and you need to be a BE company. And the BE companies are most of the time connected to the ANC, and people many times without a skill set, and then they can't deliver. That is why we had the Edwin Sodis, for example. They didn't deliver, but they get serial contracts and so on. So there's a big reason for it. The second thing that actually people perhaps forgot, in the early 90s, there was a program of privatization. It was a big, extensive privatization. I wrote an academic paper on privatization.
Do you think it was a good move?
No, just before I get to the merits of privatization or not. But in the privatizations, BE was very, very key. So you could, that's what people forget, like the state-owned privatization of companies went to, you had to have a BE partner. So, not just imagine the kind of money there. And the people who got very, very rich, there was, let's give you one example. In the telecommunications sector, there was, the former head of the ANC presidency, Smith Ngonyama, who then afterwards became South Africa's ambassador to Japan. He, from his position as the ANC head of the presidency, was part of a business called the Elephant Consortium, and they got a contract out of, for example, one of the state telecommunications privatization. So there's a whole range of, so there's almost like the Russian oligarchy. You could say what happened in Russia with Boris Yeltsin immediately after the end of the fall of the Soviet Union. A couple of people who were absolutely connected kind of mop up all of the state entities and resources, mineral contract, access to mineral rights, and so on. So we've done exactly the same thing, and so on. So BE through privatization. So that's the second part of it. And then the third part of it is the sort of BE, what we think, the conventional that the public think about BE in the private sector. So if you're a private company, you want to do business with the state, you need to have a BE partner. So that's just the third element. So you can see how extensive it's become. It is entangled the economy. Now, if you think about this, all of these 3 spheres of BE as the same people that has just been recycled. Think about Patrick Motsepe. When he was, he's been empowered many times in many companies. So in the Sanlam, the 2004 Sanlam empowerment deal, he, as a single individual, got 18 billion rand. As a single individual. If you just go back to the debates in 2004, over this, one single individual empowered. That is just one deal. So we're sitting here with, if you think about
staggering amounts of money.
That's since the 1990s, we've possibly over 1.5 trillion rand has been transferred. And that's a conservative, because other people who are actually saying 4 trillion, some surveys, so 4 trillion.
Some would argue that is black economic empowerment, but it's not broad. And that ultimately is the problem.
Well, I will reject when people say that is empowerment, because what do we mean by empowerment? Is empowerment? I guess empowerment can be said to be successful if it's went out there to empower a few individuals. Say we want to empower under 100 people.
Yeah, no,
or 100 people.
Absolutely.
We want to give them
very narrow. It should be called narrow base economic empowerment.
Because actually, so I mean, again, going back a little bit, sort of historically. During the late years of the Mbeki presidency and the early years of the Zuma presidency, there was also a political shift in empowerment within the ANC. So they started off, as I said, by empowering political capitalists, people connected to the ANC, politicians who never ran a business. In the past before, right? So there's no value that they can deliver. They just they get their shares and they're very, very happy, sit back, travel the world, live the high life, and so on, right? Marginalize the real entrepreneurs. And I said, you know, in 1990, according to an official survey of the government, there were 5 million black entrepreneurs. They were totally marginalized, right? Bang, bang. They out of it, they're not connected. Then you get these few making it. And those 5 million were still struggling. They still didn't get access to financial banks, because imagine now you are part of that 5 million, you're not connected to the ANC, you go to the bank and say, I want to be a BE partner. They look at you and say, well, you're not connected to the ANC, what are we going to get out of here? Sorry, go away. And so on. But by the late Mbeki presidency and the early Zuma presidency, the ANC shifts deliberate focus of moving, what they called was creating big industrialists, big black industrialists. This was actually the phrase that was officially used. And then there was a fund set up in the Ministry of Trade and Industry to empower what was called big black industrialists. And it started off with 5 billion. So the idea was actually to get a handful of big industrialists, what they call big black industrialists, and make them very, very rich. I mean, that's really the idea. So the idea was they have to create black Oppenheimers and black Johann Ruperts and so on. So, and again, even with that policy, they went for people who were ANC politicians.
Of course.
And maybe some senior public servants, but who were ANC public servants. So again, I mean, it is, so you empower the few. So why am I emphasizing this thing of empowering politicians and turning politicians into businessmen and businesswomen? Why am I saying? I mean, you know, firstly, from a industrialization point of view, if you look since the Second World War, you know, countries that have industrialized from poor countries and they became developed countries, and there were many of them. You know, whether it is a Mauritius in Africa, or whether it is a Singapore, whether it's a South Korea or Taiwan, and so on. So what they did, like the important parts, as I said earlier on, you need to do 2 things as a country coming out of colonialism to be successful. Get a big middle class, quickly as possible, like kind of in the society. Secondly, get a business class. So you know, so the way those countries developed their business classes, what they did is they call it what is called, they picked winners, people that are already in business. So none of those countries empowered politicians. They went for people who are already in business and who got a skill set. So your best entrepreneurs in the country already, and then you say to them, you know, we're going to support you. You're going to have to do that. So you have so what we should have done is empower firstly, non-politicians. That's really ideological. You know, don't touch politicians. Who not be in business. Don't go and give them your billions. The second thing, we should have given to people who make things, so who manufacture things. So and so on. So again, the societies that have really transformed themselves, they build businesses that made things for themselves, but for the world. So manufacturing. Why do countries fail? Why is all of the, you know, 95% 5% of African countries have failed since the first country became independent. It was 1847 was the first African country. It was Liberia. And if you think about it, over 90% of all African countries have failed since then. Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why it was, they're not building things.
That's part of the resource curse. A lot of African countries have resources, so they keep putting the resources out to fund the country instead of value adding.
Yeah, absolutely, it's part of it. But the big thing is of not creating, not making things to export, like making things.
And not making the environment favorable for people that make
things. Absolutely. So it's a combination of all of those things. So what we should have done was empower people who make things and who can export those things. Now, unfortunately, those people who make things, whether you're black or white, you're not connected to the ANC.
Yes.
And that's, a fatal flaw. I would even say is a liberation movement curse.
Yes.
An African liberation movement curse. We talk about a resource curse, but I would say there's an ideological curse of African liberation movements. That's because they so, two things, because they're so anti-business, anti-entrepreneurs, and secondly, they only just want to empower their own people, their own political people, and who are not entrepreneurs, and then it becomes a curse because you empower them, but you destroy the country's economy and the country's growth.
No, I completely agree with you. Sorry.
So I mean, we should have empowered small manufacturing, people who manufacture, and then thirdly, what we should have empowered is small and medium-sized businesses.
Yes.
Again, and we can't overemphasize that, because if you look around the world, whether it's in developed countries or developing countries, most jobs and economic growth comes from small and medium-sized businesses.
Yes.
And normally there's a ratio. So if a country has a small business, or we abbreviated as SMEs, if a society has sort of above 80% of the GDP and comes out of that, it's actually where the jobs comes from. I mean, in some countries, in Taiwan and so on, South Korea, it's 90%. Or in Germany, it's 85% plus. But we are not supporting SMEs. And again, the ANC, is this ideological thing against SMEs. I mean, the ANC believes, the liberation ideology, that SMEs are hooks. The idea of SMEs is a World Bank conspiracy, and so on. If you just read documents, they believe it's a World Bank IMF conspiracy, that you don't need SMEs, and so on. And that's why if you look at it, there's been absolutely no support for SMEs because there's no belief in it.
Yeah, well, it's quite the opposite. The way that I view the ANC-shaped economy as it stands now, even though the GNU's been for a while, I call it the ANC-shaped economy, they have actually ring-fenced and protected big corporates with all their extra red tape. Just as an example, if you're a big organization, you have accountants that can get the messy red tape work done. You have lawyers that can get the messy red tape done. For small and medium enterprises that are trying to come up and break that barrier, it's nearly impossible. These things like BEE, for example, it already favors a big organization that has a massive human resources program. They have the time to go out and find the very best and the very finest black graduates, and they're out there and available. And then they keep them for themselves, smaller enterprises, medium enterprises just don't grow, break that barrier, and that again favors the ANC. They like it that way. They collect a lot of tax money quite easily from these guys. It's easier to deploy only one or two cadres onto one or two boards instead of 50,000 boards. Yeah. And they usurp a lot of control like that.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, the fourth thing in terms of empowerment, what the ANC should have done was to empower, to look at skills and education as the main empowerment. So empowerment empowerment had worked the last 100 years. It focused on getting education right. Now, the sad part of it, the ANC has not focused on education. They cannot, just look at the ministers there being appointed. I mean, it's totally unserious.
Yeah, we've dropped the ball on education.
Yeah. So, and when I say education, it's just not education, is world-class education. So the society will have to educate Black South Africans give them in the government schools world-class education. I mean, world-class education is you get education as you're competitive with anyone in Germany or a kid in New York. That is competitive education. I mean, that's what the Chinese are doing. I mean, the big thing of the Chinese turnaround, their transformation is they say, look, we need to get kids to finish school that can act as competitive anywhere in the world. So that sort of been what we sort of done. Unfortunately, in South Africa, there's also been a lot of debate about decolonized education stuff, which is a sidetracking because for me, we even have to redefine what we mean by even concepts like decolonization. In education, it has to be world-class education. So the best that the world has have to offer, we have to be in that space, and that is decolonized education, and so on. And we have to do it very quickly. But it is also empowerment. So we must that boat also. It's now 30 years down the line, and our education is worse. I mean, for me, it's shocking. Just thinking about the shocking numbers. According to our national education department, they have 500 government schools with no mathematics education. I mean, extraordinary. And no one is marching up and down. I mean, if you want to march, if you want to be angry, if you want to be a youth, a black activist, that is your thing.
I've maintained that before. I've said this several times. First of all, I completely agree with you in terms of our education space being absolutely rotten. We've stuffed it up all the way from the bottom. I think that we need to almost to some extent, and you're not going to like this because I know you're a professor at a university, but to some extent we almost need to, given that there's resource constraints in South Africa, ignore universities and technicons for a while. Not ignore them, but just kind of maintain them. And we need to go to children that aren't even born yet and need to start looking after kids from what Adrian Saville calls the first 1,000 days of life. Prenatal care, natal care, early childhood education, very good primary school education where we really take pride in things like maths and science because that's what makes you globally competitive and makes children globally competitive when they need to be employed. And only then, when we've got that crop gone through primary school, gone through high school, then we really need to focus on university, when we've got the ingredients, that input line of ingredients really working well. Instead, we've got completely the opposite in South Africa. Nobody wants to go into the teaching profession anymore because the working conditions are terrible. You get terribly paid. We've got things like the Bella Bill, early childhood education in South Africa. Something like 40% of children in South Africa are permanently stunted because of lack of early childhood nutrition. That means cognitive stunting as well. How do you expect an education system to make the best of it when their baseline ingredients have been compromised?
For me, it's just being, that focus on creating political capitalists in BE has taken us away from the real focus, because the ANC has been so doggedly, I call it doggedly, if you just see the defense of BE right now for this to continue, I wish we had the same doggedness to get black youngsters a proper education. This country would change if we had the same energy that's going into defending the current BE that's only benefiting a small number of people. If that same energy can go into getting our education system, world-class education system right, we will change this country. So even our priorities, our political priorities are totally wrong, in the wrong places. We are putting all of our energy, if you look at our public debate, it's so skewed. It's not focusing on why do we have 500 schools which are majority black kids are there in those schools, don't have mathematics, and the figures are even worse for other subjects. I think this is the government's own statistics. There's like 2,000 plus schools with no economics or accounting.
Well, children can't read for meaning in South Africa. Primary school children are unable to read for meaning. It's one of the worst global benchmarks possible for education, and that will cost us all the way into the future
I mean, I want, if you're activists and if you're young activists,
yes,
these are the places that you have to focus on because this is actually what matters. Everything else doesn't matter.
I've said that before because I did my thesis on fees must fall, and I was a university student at the time. I was there on the front lines when people were tipping over police vans and people were getting shot with rubber bullets. I never got shot because I was white. And the problem is that nursery school teachers and primary school kids, they can't go burn things and turn over dustbins and toy in the street. So they don't get a proportionate voice in the melee of the conversation, especially given that social media, which is a voice multiplier, force multiplier for your cause, is something that's really for teenagers and above. Kids in nursery school, they don't have cell phones, they're not on Facebook and Twitter. And as a result, you get these disproportionate voices. I say the same thing about Julius Malema. He gets 9% of the vote, but 29% of the media airtime.
Absolutely. I mean, it also says many people unfortunately still think that protesting is the most powerful form of change in South Africa. I mean, yes, we're coming from a tradition during the apartheid era when Black South Africans didn't have rights and they couldn't change politics. They could only do it through protest. Now in a democracy, we have a vote, which is like a superpower. Voting, that people don't understand, is a superpower to change their lives. It is absolutely a superpower above protesting.
Yes.
And so the sad part, people have the vote, but they vote against their own interests. Why do I say they vote for their own poverty? Yes. They vote for their own marginalization. They vote to stay unemployed. They vote not to get public services. So this superpower that people have, they use it against them.
Yes.
They use it. They people voting to be unemployed. They vote to get poor education because, why am I saying that? People are now linking their vote to change by voting based on the past, by voting for people of the same color, or voting based on ideology and not voting for competence. Voting because your family voted like that, and so you repeat. So then you vote for poverty over and over and over again, and then people get, well, they vote for the same people, or they vote for people whose competency is singing or shouting slogans. Or being a victim, and then expect, or even people who are corrupt, and then expect that there's going to be change. If you're going to vote for a person who's violent, then you have to expect violence. If you vote for a person who's corrupt, expect corruption. If you vote for a person who's never run anything in their life beyond politics, vote for failure then. And so on. So for me, is how do we get ordinary South Africans to understand this superpower of voting?
Our voter turnout is extremely low in South Africa, and quite interestingly enough, that actually favors, for example, the Democratic Alliance, because it's a lot of the time poorer, more disadvantaged, more marginalized voters, like you say, that don't go out to the polls, whereas you find the upper middle class to upper class white South Africans, they all turn out at the polls. So there's very interesting dynamics. I'd like to just go back and mention one thing very quickly about empowerment and preferential procurement. Dr. Franz Cronje, who I trust quite vehemently, I don't know if you know who he is. He's he's a statistician, does a lot of great polling data. And his company recently put out a statement to say that preferential procurement in South African BE costs the South African public roughly 1 billion rand a day from his calculation. And that is basically the amount that we're borrowing from banks, the South African economy. And he actually says South Africa's fiscal position actually isn't that bad, that we can actually turn things around very quickly. He said, if you just end preferential procurement in BEE, we'll need to stop borrowing. He said, just that in itself, I don't know if you want to make a comment on that, or if you...
So I won't make a comment directly on what he was saying, but let me just give you my view, which is separately or independently from his view, so I haven't seen it yet. So I've proposed the ways to tweak this BE, this thing is to, because our country right now is an economic crisis. We in an economic emergency.
Yes.
Yeah. So what can we do? There are some low-hanging fruits things we can do.
Yes.
One of the things is to set aside BE in growth in catalytic industries. That's the first thing. Almost immediately put it aside, and so on. And in growth sectors, do that. The second thing is also in the state procurement, in the growth sectors of state procurement.
Yes.
Do away with it, and so on. And where BE takes place, make it merit-based.
Yes.
A merit-based BE in the sectors which are not growth sectors, because you've got black business people who are very competent, but they're not connected.
100%.
So and so on. So that has to be initial pillars of what we need to do almost immediately. And then also we have to do something else. We have to say, well, because of state failure, we're not going to turn around state failure overnight. Now, in the meantime, in the critical areas of delivery, where the state is failing, bring in the private sector and civil society to deliver services until we can turn around the state. I mean, I was part of the panel of the inquiry, the President Cyril Ramaphosa's inquiry on the professionalization of public service.
Yes.
Now, let me tell you, as a person who's been on that, there is part of our state and public service that is not going to be turned around. I mean, people can scream and shout as much as they want and be... the reality is, it's some parts of our state is so rotten. It's not going to deliver. You can't turn it around. You either have to close them down, or you have to cull the leadership.
Yes.
Totally, and change the culture. And we know how difficult it is to change the organizational culture, institutional culture. It's not an overnight thing. So part of our state is like gone.
Yes.
Then if we can then make a decision to say, well, it's gone, but maybe over the long term, we're going to try to clean it up. Yes. But when one cleans it up, there's not going to be any delivery possible. So then in the interim, or in the meantime, get the private sector and NGOs and civil society organizations to deliver those services. So I mean, that really is what we will have to do. And then we have to get the other things right also. We have to get our education system absolutely right.
Couldn't agree
I mean, we absolutely have to get that right. And we may actually even, if we call it an emergency in our education system, may even have to say, well, we're cutting the unions out also. Almost immediately. And I'm not an anti-union person. I mean, my first job was in COSATU in the trade union. That was my first job after university. I mean, the first proper paycheck. I was working at COSATU, at the Concrete Salary and Trade Unions head office. Obviously, I didn't last very long. I realized I'm not a trade unions quite quickly. Maybe not very, very quickly, but it's kind of over months. To get growth going and to deal with our economic crises, we have to essentially suspend BE in growth sectors in our country. And then what we need to do is we have to almost immediately focus on new industries that we don't have, but we need and the world needs.
Yes.
I mean, for example, critical minerals.
Yes.
The world needs that. Technology. We have to get that going. And maybe also what we need to change also would be to find alternative ways of BE for the private sector. What are the alternative ways? We would look at what is our growth sectors, and then if the growth sectors become if companies develop our growth sectors and our new sectors, they will then become BE in the sectors. For example, we've got a 60% youth unemployment. So we have to say, if the companies take on the unemployed, that is BEE.
Yes.
That's the first thing. If a company we've got an infrastructure crisis. Our infrastructure has collapsed to such an extent that it undermines economic growth, and it's also a reason why we have more and more unemployment and poverty, because we now have no infrastructure, and because our infrastructure is collapsing, we also have high inflation and things are expensive because you so on. So if we have to then get, in lieu of BE, get companies to build public infrastructure, and then say that's BE. And we need small business that manufacture. So we say, well, if companies support new manufacturing, manufacturing, give them the money, that is BE. And the same, something as simple as in Johannesburg, our city. Johannesburg delivers 70% of our 1/7 of our GDP. Is totally collapsing. In a city, no one wants to go there. So what we can say, well, in lieu of BE, if a company take over a couple of buildings, clean it up, fix it up, that is BE. Get it going, it is BE.
No, I completely agree with you. We need to reimagine the space of black economic empowerment and what it really means in South Africa. It's completely failed as far as I'm concerned. It's interesting that you say that the ANC is ideologically so rotten that it's going to be very, very difficult or take a very, very long time to rescue the ANC. I believe as a liberation movement that it's going the same way that many, many other liberation movements have gone before the ANC, and that is to eventually disappear out of power. We've seen it with a lot of other African countries in our region in the last couple of years. And I think that the ANC is destined to be just a kind of rural outlying party. They'll maintain their 10 or 20% sometime in the future, but I don't think that they are going to last into the future. South Africa is about to see a very, very big and monumental change going forward in the next 10 years. I think that we have really started to see a turning point with certain things. I was wondering how you think BEE is actually going to hold up if we aren't just going to get a very watered down version of black economic empowerment anyway, once it's been run through the courts over the next decade.
Let me just talk about in terms of what's, the ANC's potential trajectory. Can the ANC renew, right? Just the first thing is there are not many liberation movements or independent movements that have renewed in government.
Yes,
that's just just to start.
I
off
can't
with
think any.
The only and in Africa, the ones that renewed were actually only when they were in opposition and they didn't have power, and they kind of clean up totally because they didn't have access to power and so on. So there's like the two options. There are examples of renewal, but they're very few. As I say, for example, in Cape Verde, the PIGC, which is like a party like the ANC Liberation Movement, they actually managed to renew, but they had to be in opposition. They were in opposition, cleaned up, got a whole new leadership, everything, they kind of have the internal fighting, cleaned up and so on, and then they actually returned to power, never with massive majorities. They returned to power either just like 49, 48 coalition, or just like 50 or so on, 51, never to ever to be dominant thereafter. So that's one trajectory, and that's actually in Africa possibly only party. There is Mauritius, with the Labour Party, so the independence movement, they were actually totally out of power, but they returned to power, but never on their own, always in a coalition.
Yes.
Yeah, so they've never absolutely returned. Then the other political parties, obviously, liberation and independence movement, they're gone now, whether in Zambia, so they do not exist. There are liberation movements that is holding on to power through violence, that is, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. They're supposed to be out of power, but they are they're terrorizing, they're stealing votes, they're hitting the opposition, and that's like they're holding on to power that way through violence, right?
Yes.
And the same in Mozambique. holding on to power, and the same in Tanzania. I mean, sad part was 2 weeks ago, the Tanzanian president claims to have gotten 98%. In the vote. I mean, just think about it. I mean, really, I mean, like that.
Yeah. He got 104%.
Exactly. So let's just bring the 104 down. Oops, sorry.
Don't worry about that.
Just bring that. Sorry.
No, leave it.
Just bring that 104% down to 98. Bring it to 98. So
with a 103% approval rate.
So bring it down to 98 so it looks a little bit. So, I mean, that's it. That's a trajectory. There's another trajectory. It's in Algeria, which potentially may be option to ANC. Sadly, Algeria. Their liberation movement clung onto power through a civil war in the early 90s. I mean, it was a devastating civil war. They're still trying to come out of that, from an economic point of view. But essentially, the liberation movement is still there, but it is not a liberation movement as it was before. It is now just a party for state, to get state power, essentially. Yes. So the ANC could become like the Algerian, the FLN, which is a Algerian liberation movement. It kind of gets liquidated, but people continue with it, sort of its carcass, in name only, so everyone and so on, and it's kind of stay in power not as like big majorities, but really with no ideology, but just living based on the past.
Yes.
So you kind of get voted in just based on the past, on a rural vote, because so rural voters will still continue to vote and so on. So that's another way of staying close to power. Maybe not dominant, but staying close to power. The alternatives of renewal. I mean, that's like one successful renewal in the world of independence movement, and that is Singapore, the People's Action Party. Yes. Right, but they had to do that quite dramatically. What they did was they essentially decided to clean up their party. They fired essentially 50% or so of the National Executive Committee, of the Parliamentary Caucus. So everyone was incompetent, everyone was corrupt, and so on. They did that. And then what they did is they hired an HR firm from the UK. And then they said, look, recruit people who are not members of this party.
Yes. And
they did it. They advertised.
Technocratic.
Yeah, they advertised. Yeah. They say, come and we can interview you, independent people can interview. And then they appoint those people to the National Executive Committee and as members of Parliament. I mean, just think about it.
It would be amazing. I mean, imagine if they did that. We're so used to incompetence in South Africa that it's just become the absolute norm, even in spaces where you should have highly educated people, very experienced people. South Africa, police minister was never a policeman, health minister was never a doctor. Okay, I know that's not the case now, but
absolutely. So those are renewable. I mean, I was in 2017 at the ANC organized a conference was called the special conference of party veterans. Yes. So that conference was 2017. It was put together to actually get Zuma out, who was then the president, and then Zuma refused to go to the conference. I mean, he didn't attend. Yeah. And then they had to call it a special night. So they had to call it a conference of party veterans and so on. Yeah. Because it was the only conference that, there's a president of the ANC never arrived in. Yeah. They then asked me to do two things for that conference. I wrote a paper for them on how to modernize the ANC. So that was in 2017. And then the other one, which I did, I facilitated a conversation between the ANC leaders and business, because at that time, there was like a massive fallout with big business in South Africa over the corruption that's going on and so on. So there's two things I did. And on the modernization, I mean, my proposals to them was like, either the Singapore route, which is like you just cut out all corrupt people. Well, obviously politically, that's very difficult.
What a pleasure that must have been to see. Yeah.
But there's another way, actually a middle way, which is not really, you can't call it traditional renewal, but as the Indian Congress Party had a like kind of midway renewal type of at some point. So what happened with them is that in the early 90s, they decided to appoint a chap who became Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, who became Prime Minister. He was not a member of the Congress Party. They initially appointed him as the head of the Reserve Bank, and then from there as finance minister, and eventually prime minister. So, and he came from a very small community in India, the Sikh community, was pronouncing it, and so on. So he was not your traditional Congress party member. And in fact, prior to 1990, he actually lived outside India. He was actually working in Geneva for the what was called the South Commission. It was run by Julius Nyerere. He was the secretary of it. And then before that, he'd actually spent in the UK. He was a scholarship. He came from a very, very poor background, and he was a kind of scholarship boy.
Yes.
And he went to Cambridge, and he did a master's and PhD. So he'd actually
amazing. He'd actually worked
outside. He was outside
someone with real competence.
Outside India for a very, very long time, and then work actually in Africa. I mean, through the South Commission, essentially. And that's really he was drafted in out of nowhere.
He didn't come up through the caste system.
Absolutely, totally. And the interesting thing with him is, when he was appointed prime minister, and he was given a mandate to renew both the government and the Indian Congress Party. So what he wanted was a mandate to clean up. And what he did essentially was an aggressive reform that went against the Congress Party ideologies. Yes. He was not liked by ordinary members and leaders of the Congress Party. I mean, he was not even a typical politician. I mean, he was soft-spoken. He would meditate. And he was not so, and even his voice, people made fun of him because he was not like in politics. I mean, it's like you have to think about it. Imagine now, you bring in South Africa a non-typical, let's call it liberation politics type of person. I mean, here our politics, people vote for you if you sing, if you blame other people. If you come out with rhetoric, if you say it's a white monopoly, capital is the reason for all of our problems, or if you say a party is the reason for all of our problems, you'll be voted in. If you say I'm for black people, you'll be voted in. Now, if let's imagine ANZ bringing somebody totally out of that and say, and somebody would say, don't be a victim.
Yes.
So stop being victims.
Yes.
We're not going to blame apartheid. We're not going to blame colonialism. Yeah. We're not going to blame foreigners. We're not going to blame other people. We're just going to get on with a job. And so imagine, I mean, sadly, when I say people vote for poverty and people vote for unemployment, they vote for somebody who's violent, somebody who says, I'm a revolutionary. Yes. The white people are the bad people. The West are the terrible. The World Bank is terrible. White monopoly capital is controlling everything. You get all of your votes, right? People are going to vote for you. So now if you get somebody who's going to say everything against that and say, no, this is what we're going to do here. Yes. We're going to get an education system right immediately. We're going to bring in small business, black small business immediately. We're going to get technology going immediately. We're going to get our school system right immediately. We'll change the universities to focus on science and immediately, and that's what we're going to do. I mean, we're not going to be singing.
In a way, that's the savior that South Africa needs right now.
Absolutely. So it's like a sort of a counter-culture politician, a liberation movement politician.
Yes.
So that was the Indians would sing. And it was sing changed India extraordinarily. I mean, in terms of, it took hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. I mean, so the Indian economic growth was actually, he delivered it. I mean, India is now growing faster than China. Then he brought it by changing society that way.
And interestingly enough, that legacy's lasted on, and it's a good place to segue because we've been very focused on ANC's internal tensions in South Africa's regional politics this morning. Yeah. And I think South Africa should have emulated what India had done to a large extent with India's foreign policy. Mm-hmm. So that legacy that he left behind continues on now. And you can see it in the way that India deals with everyone. They trade with everybody, or they do their best. I know they're having some tensions with the USA at the moment, but they do their best to trade with everyone. And it's been incredibly good for their economy. It's been good for social upward movement, and we have not done that. We've gone completely the opposite. Instead of trying to negotiate with the US in good faith, we've been combative. We just haven't been very good at our foreign policy, and I'd like to maybe just ask you what you think of our South Africa's current foreign policy tensions, and specifically in relation to the very costly economic tensions that have arisen with Donald Trump and the USA.
Every policy, given the fact that I said we're in an economic emergency, we got the highest unemployment of any emerging market. I mean, so you start off, we got the highest youth unemployment of any emerging market or any country that's not in a war. I mean, if that doesn't work, it doesn't have to give our political leaders sleepless nights.
And some other great numbers, like the high 70 murdered.
We got a murder. We got the highest murder rate, 30, 40 kids starved to death, I mean, on a daily basis. I mean, if that doesn't keep your politicians, sleepless nights, the focus, so our politicians are not focusing on those things.
No, not at all.
The things that actually matter to us. Singing is not going to change that. Starting ideology is not going to change that. And so on. Calling revolutionary slogans is not going to change that. We're going to have to focus all of our policies to get, to get rule of law back.
Yes,
to get growth going, to prevent children from starving. So all of our policies, including foreign policies. So every policy that if on foreign policies, we have to make a decision, say, if we go for this foreign policy, there can be less black children starving to death, right? If we have this foreign policy, are we going to have less people murdered on a day?
Yes.
Like, if the policy doesn't change that, then we can't have the foreign policy. It's a luxury to have a foreign policy that does not deliver growth and does not deliver development. And unfortunately, our foreign policy has been based, sadly, on ideology, on outdated ideology, on, our country has been partnering with friends of the ANC during the Cold War, where other countries focus their foreign policies on economic growth. China focus their foreign policy on economic growth. Even Russia focus their foreign policy. India focus. Like, every country is maximizing economic growth, employment, poverty reduction in their foreign policy. We must be the only country in the world that focus our foreign policies based on the past, based on emotions, based on ideology, and not based on our country's interests, and so on. So let's get to the US. A lot of, our foreign policy against the US for years has been anti-growth.
Yes.
That's the first thing we have to come out. So all of this stuff, the US hostility against us does not come from solidarity and all of the white right-wing groups. It comes from our own policies over the last couple of years. I have been, I don't want to say shouting and screaming, but writing and talking over and over the last 10 years to say, if we continue with the anti-American policies, ANC, it's going to hit us at some point. And I'm not the only person. Many, many people have been saying that. Many, many people have been saying it. So if you can go back and look at how we've been warning the ANC, it's that it is now own interest, isn't growth interest, is for employment interest, for only black South African interest, that we have a good relationship with the US. The US... Technically, the US is our second biggest, I'm saying technically our trading partner, and China is our biggest trading partner, technically on volume. But let me just, but if we make the calculations, the US actually is our biggest trading partner. If we include, if we look at trade holistically, what we get out of the US to start off with, US companies in South Africa employ upwards to 400,000, 500,000 people. Companies are in South Africa. That's the first thing. Although China is our biggest trading partner, if the Chinese companies employ 10,000 people in South Africa, that's massive.
Yes, they bring their own people.
So what the US companies do in South Africa, they manufacture things. When you manufacture things, you employ more people and you employ local things. You bring in local technology. The Chinese development model is not manufacturing in foreign countries.
Yes.
The only foreign countries that actually manufacture is in Vietnam, and that's the only country.
China has an extractive relationship with us, where US value
absolutely,
adds.
So the Chinese model is they build all of the things, they create all the jobs in China, and then they're moving to a country like South Africa, and they displace our jobs.
Yes.
And so on. So they kill all of our industries, our steel industry, our ore industry, our tire industry, because they bring the things, our car industry, they bring the things here and they destroy our industry. Not only in our country, but all the other countries. All countries in the world are now the countries who want to get economic growth, who want to safeguard employment in their country, and who want to seriously deal with poverty, and who's not focusing on ideology and that sort of stuff. Two things that they try to do. They're trying to get a best deal with the US. And the US cantankerous, yes, but they're still trying to get a best deal. And they're trying to get a way also to deal with China. That's the second. So the two objectives of every serious country in the world: dealing with the US, try to get a deal out of the US.
Yes.
And secondly, trying to get China out of the economy.
Yes.
That's the two foreign policy objectives must be of every country that wants to be competitive. We're not doing that.
I think the ANC is intellectually bereft. And what happens is I deal with people like you fairly often. And you're an outlier. You are cognitively very high-powered, and you're extremely well and broadly read by anybody's measure, by a global measure. And I think a lot of South Africans forget how intellectually bereft our parliament is. We have a lot of people in there that can't even do the absolute basics. They're almost illiterate to some extent, some people in politics. And recently somebody raised the idea that even our very basic people, like local councillors, should have to have at least a matric certificate in order to serve. And there's been an enormous pushback on that to say it's unconstitutional, which it is, as far as I understand, and that it's unfair and you shouldn't have these barriers to political representation. But we do honestly have a problem where if you went to many politicians in South Africa and you said, hey, look, your policy won't be good for infant mortality rate, they'd say, what's infant mortality rate? I've never heard of it before. The thing is because we have a generation of politicians, liberation movement politicians that dominated our politics, and who they're indoctrinated with a liberation ideology, which is outdated. They against entrepreneurship. They're against independent thinking in a way. So they've just repeat the old slogans for policy and ideology for thinking. It's the 1970s. That's unfortunately is a problem. But unfortunately, also sadly, the new parties that came out of the ANC repeat. They do the same. So and that's our problem. So we've actually have a whole new generation of younger parties. They came after the ANC that are exactly the same. Same so we are in for a disaster unless as a country. So even if the ANC leave, say the ANC get out of power, but the new political parties, even younger people, repeat the same logic of the ANC. So, and we need to break from the logic of the ANC. That's going to be the thing. There's a very fantastic South African woman called Katlego Moagi, and she calls it the ANC and the ANC's babies. And then Bonza Shongwe, bless him, he calls it ANC light diet ANC. That it's that same. And what happens is, again, it's very centralization led. These people, they want to centralize absolutely everything. So instead of privatize, everything must be nationalized, brought back within the government control. And what happens is that is contra to global trade right now. Global trade, if you want to benefit from global trade and from the trade of globalization and the powers that people like Donald Trump do have. You have to be more open. You have to be less shut off. You have to be less centralized. And the ANC took an enormous punt to try and centralize powers just before the GNU came into place. We saw they forced through EWC, they forced through Bella, they forced through NHI. And I think the whole world has looked at this as a collective South African problem, not just necessarily an isolated ANC thing. I think it's very difficult for a lot of international observers to understand that a lot of this is ANC driven, and that 80% of the country are moderates. It really hasn't been.
Yes, the challenge of the GNU that we have now is that the ANC is in a government of national unity, but the ANC behaves as if it's still the majority party.
Correct.
And it's pushing its policies, its party policies as GNU policies, instead of making it a proper multi-party setup. And a multi-party setup and a coalition is parties agree on new policies. You can't have the former majority party policies. But the sad part of it is a lot of ANC voters and supporters also think, well, a GNU is an ANC with the other parties just add on. So the ANC policies become a GNU policies. This is like a total misunderstanding of what coalitions in a democracy works. Coalition works, you come up with new policies. I mean, that is what coalition is all about. You can't have one party's policies and say, well, these are good policies. We just need to implement the policies. No, if you didn't get a majority, then you have to put a coalition together. They have to change all your policies. You have to throw out all your policies. Doesn't matter.
I think the non-cooperation, ANC's non-cooperation, has actually backfired on them in this last couple of years, and it's going to diminish their vote going into 2026. Every single place that the ANC refused to negotiate with the GNU, actually they lost votership. They didn't realize with NHI that there was such an enormous portion of black South Africans that had medical aid or aspired to have medical aid and didn't want NHI. They forced through that policy because they're ideologues, and in the end they lost votes because a lot of people turned around and said, we don't want this, and they can't get out of their way of their own ideologies, not on a global geopolitical level with guys like Donald Trump, and not on a local regional level. And I simply don't think that they will succeed in any kind of renewal before they get diminished to a so-called rural party. But speaking of education, obviously you're very experienced in the education space. South Africa has seen a very heavy politicization of the university space. So just for example, Professor Jansen at the University of the Free State, going back around 15 years ago, said that the SRC at universities have been usurped and the power has been stolen by political parties, that they no longer represent the interests of students internally, and that you have parties like the ANC Youth League or the EFF Youth League or the DA Youth League, and they come in there and they entrench their party ideologies within university spaces, and it slowly starts to corrupt the space away from an academic space into a politicized space. I believe that there's some truth to that, but you're a professor of governance in a big university. I was wondering what you think of that.
Let me just start with our higher education system, maybe, because that's absolutely important to reform. We need to reform our higher education system. I mean, right now, our focus has been on universities. So everyone, you finish matric and you try to get into universities. Now, in the emerging markets, technical education and vocational education is absolutely critical.
Yes.
I mean, that actually fuels emerging market growth, comes out of that. So that's just a first. So, and sadly, I mean, the ANC has broken down vocational education and technical education. All of the technical schools that were really, really good in your party era closed down.
Education
in the
systems
rural
that make
areas.
entrepreneurs.
All of these sort of technical colleges, from agriculture to teachers' colleges to nursing colleges, were all closed down. And then the ANC, I thought, made a major absolute mistake, and we're now suffering from it, is even our technicons, moving our technicons into universities and merging universities and so on. What we need is we need to reform the higher education system if we want to get the growth. So first part of it is we really have to make our technical education system, our technical colleges, vocational education colleges, make it really relevant for our economy, competent, because that whole space has been politicized. The ancient cadre has been deployed there, and they've obviously ran all of their space into ground. But that has significance to our economy. So we've got young people. They finish school. They've got, they don't have a skill set. Wrong subjects, as I say. I mean, if you're going to have schools, 500 schools with no mathematics, meaning those kids are done for their whole life is gone. Their whole life, totally gone. But we don't have the university students, the activists at university, where the SRCs or the activists outside university who are young. They're not focusing on getting the education right, getting technical education. They're not mobilizing against it. They're mobilizing on political issues.
To know better, I don't think.
And so on. They're mobilizing for irrelevant political things rather than say we have to get the education system right. And how do we get the education system right? We have to get at the universities. We have to focus the universities on science, engineering, technology, medicine, economic sciences. That is what the universities must. That's what we need to do. If you think about the new universities, for example, that were created, there were 4 or 5 new universities created up to 1994. They focus on things like biblical studies and stuff. Yes. I mean, how do we even allow that? Where are the young people to mobilize against that? Where are the civil society organizations to mobilize against that? Because if we're going to have any new university, any new higher education institution must focus on science or technology, on technical things. You can't have a university focus on anything else. And I think what we need to do with the former historical black universities, they're all struggling with it. They're really struggling. We must turn them all into science universities, like overnight. Then we must do the same in matric. We have to change the system of kids getting through schooling from primary school. We actually must make over 50, 60% of kids to 80% focusing on science. It's like we have to re-engineer from bottom up, and that is where we can bring in the BE to say, if we can get companies as part of BE actually adopt hundreds and hundreds of schools and turn those schools, government schools, into science schools. That has happened in Japan, for example. I mean, that's what they did after the Second World War.
And apprenticeship programs to bring back the linked apprenticeship programs with the Technocratic. Those things worked absolutely brilliantly. They got people into employment very quickly. They made people that were empowered for life. I've now said this on the podcast with a couple of people. I think I spoke about it with Edwin Cameron to say that we have complete economic misalignment with our universities. In an ideal world, you should be producing the kind of citizens that your job market requires. And in South Africa, we always seem to be job market over here, education stream over there, and it's adding to the...
No, totally. It's adding, I mean, for example, there are job opportunities, for example, technical job opportunities, but we don't have people. So we've got unemployment, but the people don't have the skill sets.
Absolutely.
So we really have to make it a priority to get artisanships back at a mass level, at an absolute mass level, because that will actually plug our unemployment. Now we have to import people. To be welders, to Eskom to import people.
I had an enormous pushback from police in South Africa. I'm sure you need to go. We'll have to end this fairly soon. I had an enormous pushback from police in South Africa, both policing leadership and police on the ground. I recently made a comment in relation to Ricardo Teixeira, the military and defense expert. And he said to me, one of the biggest problems in South Africa is that we don't want graduate policemen. We don't go out of our way to recruit graduates as policemen. And everybody came back and they said, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about because he was never a police officer and you only need on-the-ground training, blah, blah, blah. But what it does is it feeds back into the education with the apprenticeship system, where you should go get the diploma, the 3-year degree or the 4-year degree or the 2-year diploma, and then go into your apprenticeship.
I mean, so those people make the argument just absolutely wrong. Look at General Nhlanhla Makwanala, Mzansi. I mean, he's a graduate.
Yes.
I mean, you can see
Not
the difference between
a graduate. He's well graduate.
Yeah, no, look at the difference between him as a police person and look at his peers. I mean, it is light and day.
It's chalk and cheese.
Yeah, absolutely. So what the police need is we need to get more people with technical education into the police, because the police are not on the beat. Now you have to do diagnosis, there's forensic, there's investigation, there's tech investigation, there's cybercrime. You need graduates. So again, it's like almost all of our institutions are based in old era. Cybercrime. We got all kinds of stuff. You need graduates like I don't know, computer science. So, but if you're going to have people who deploy as your police commissioners and police ministers who absolutely have no understanding, they deploy, say, they have absolutely no understanding of the real economy, you're going to have those kind of arguments. That's why we have the misalignment. Come back to the deployment. You're deploying people to be police commissioners who absolutely have no understanding. Firstly, no technical understanding of the job, but secondly, they don't understand the economy. Or the real economy. So, they can't make those decisions.
Sometimes when I hear these guys speak, I've done quite a lot of research in education, especially at the lower levels. And if I can be completely honest with you, a guy like Beki Cele, I mean, he has more or less the cognitive capacity and worldly knowledge, not to be too rude to him, of your kind of like average primary school child. I know that it's kind of rude for me to say this because he's a grown man, obviously my elder, but this is a man that is absolutely intellectually bereft, knew nothing about anything. And I think that this has been one of the most absolutely detrimental things, again, just about cadre deployment and the way that we've allowed completely intellectually bereft people to take charge of some of our biggest institutions in the country. And I coincidentally think the ANC would have been successful in its complete national democratic revolution if it had just slowed down in the first 15 years. If they'd come in the first 15 years and said, guys, we're not going to be in a rush to do this now. We're going to deploy our cadres into apprenticeship programs, into these big corporates and these big spaces and these big industrial places. And over 10 or 15 years, we'll build them up and we'll slow out the timeline of the NDR. I think the ANC would be in a significantly different position to the one that they're in today.
I just think in terms of, there's something about liberation ideologies which is very difficult for those liberation movements to govern properly, is the idea that you can take any cadre and put that cadre to run sophisticated technical companies because of their political experience. The idea that just because you've been in politics and you've been an activist, you can run an engineering firm successfully. That idea, and unfortunately that idea is also now widespread in society because the ANC have, that culture of the ANC, that idea has gone across black society, and that's what people think. And then secondly, related to that is the misunderstanding about institutions and organizations. When you destroy an organization, institution, it's very difficult to rebuild it.
Yes.
I mean, in the private sector, for example, think about it, like companies like Stutterford's, been there, was one of our oldest companies. I mean, it collapsed.
They used to have multiple floors and whole.
So now in the state, unfortunately, companies should be collapsed like Stutterford's after they've been brought down, but people insist and for those companies to continue. And then it bails out with the same people. And it just sucks taxpayers' money and it doesn't deliver the services. So it's easy to destroy an institution, but very difficult to rebuild institutions. Think about ESCOM. It was easy to destroy it in 5-10 years, but to rebuild it that people don't understand, it'll take another 10 years to rebuild.
Yes.
And that is how it works. You don't, after you've broken down the institution, particularly a state institution, it takes you a decade, and you can then only do it with radical surgery of just firing almost everyone and bringing in totally new people and then changing the organizational culture. It is that difficult. So, and that is why activists have to fight corruption and cadre deployment, because once a system is corrupt, it is very difficult, often takes generations to turn around. So if ordinary South Africans, or ordinary black South Africans, allow corrupt people to take over complex state institutions, it is very unlike. So if you were an unemployed voter and you voted for a party that deployed people without skills to run sophisticated companies, it is very unlikely that you will ever get employed in your lifetime.
Yes.
That is why I'm coming back to the vote, why we somehow have to get people to understand that you have to vote for competence. If you don't vote for competence, you have to, hold your nose and vote for someone that don't look like you, that don't speak like you, that you don't agree with, but who is actually technically competent and who will deliver the things for you. And that is the magic of voting. But the magic of voting and the magic of democracy only works if you vote for competence. So you have to put everything else aside. You have to put the singing aside. You put the ideology aside. You have to put the past aside when you go into the voting booth. So you have to vote for you. You have to vote for your children if you have children, and vote for you. But you can only, to vote for you, you have to make you have to cross a psychological barrier. And the psychological barrier is, in that voting vote, you cannot vote based on the past. Yes. So it's a psychological barrier that you need to cross.
Yes.
And you cannot vote for people because they're the same color as you, or because your family voted, and because for those people or those parties, the community voted for those parties. You have to cross that psychological barrier for yourself. Now, if the majority of black South Africans, if a majority don't cross that barrier, they will stay in poverty and unemployment, because they will then continue to vote for, you vote for black people because they're black, you vote for people because they speak the same language as you, you vote for people that you emotionally affinity for them, or your family have affinity for them. So once you vote on that basis, you will vote for continued unemployment, continued poverty, continued lawlessness, and so on.
I think. I mean that's an amazing. I was going to ask you if there's any last final parting shot that you'd like to offer every guest, final comment. But I mean, I guess that was so succinct, and it was such a powerful comment that I guess we can kind of leave it there. I'll just make one quick response to that, which is to say, I believe that the tide is turning. I believe that I've seen in front of my own eyes in the last 5 years an awakening, a very slow awakening of the South African voter base. People are starting to be much more politically engaged. Like no South African, 99% of South Africans had never even heard of the national budget until the GNU was involved in the negotiation of the national budget, because all of a sudden they had a team in the Budget World Cup and they wanted to support their team, and it became more contentious. And I definitely think that the tides are turning. I think we're going to see a big shift inside the metros in 2026. Even in Cape Town, there's probably going to be a little bit of a shift at least, but in the other metros and bigger cities for sure. And I think 2029, the ANC always historically does worse in national than it does in local. And I am very, very optimistic and very positive about South Africa's future going forward. I think we can turn this country around. We can get economic growth up. And I just want to thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, maybe if there is a last thing, it's about a local government
for elections. For you, any last things, you can go on forever.
I mean, if it's just on a local government elections, because we've got a local government elections coming next year.
Yes.
You know, most of our services are delivered at the local government level.
Almost.
So people do not understand that. So if one gets one's vote wrong at the local government level, there's not going to be any services.
Yes.
There's going to be potholes. There's going to be water shortages and so on. So unfortunately, people vote for potholes, and people vote for water shortages, and people vote for grime and for dirt at a local level, because they vote at a local level again based on political parties of the past that they supported, bringing the past and so on, and they vote for people based on the color and so on. So, you know, my advice to voters, you know, this is a very decisive local government election.
Definitely.
So, you know, what are the criteria that people have to look at when you go vote? What's the criteria? First, you look at a person. You vote for a person at a local level. A person must have the experience of running an entity, an organization outside politics. That's the first thing.
Yes.
So when you look at the people that you vote for, the first thing is you check their backgrounds. Did they run something in the real economy outside politics? Right.
Yes.
That's the first thing. The second thing is, do not vote for people who are lifelong politicians at a local level. If this is a serial politician, do not vote for such a person.
I agree with you completely.
Almost immediately.
You want somebody who has options in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And also vote for someone who's honest and who's not corrupt. If you're going to vote for corrupt people at a local level, you can get corruption. So absolutely, if there's any shenanigans, do not vote for a person, and, you know, honest person. Do not vote for people who are violent. If you're going to vote for anyone who's violent, if you're going to vote for somebody who shoots guns in public, you will get violence.
Yes.
You'll get violence in your community. You will get violence in your country. You do not vote for anyone who's violent.
Yes.
That's very, very important. You vote for people also that has actually been involved in political community activities also.
Yes.
Has the person sit on the school board, for example, or is a voluntary outside politics? That's very, very important.
People that actually care about the community.
Absolutely, because that's how you see people care. There's no other ways that you can see what people care for their communities. Yeah, I mean, even if they're in a running club, your local running club, you know, and so on. That's very, very important. And so on. Obviously, there's another aspect of it which is very, very difficult. How does a person live? Obviously, that's not as easy for a voter to determine that. But if you see the person driving with a Lamborghini and living the high life and so on, do not vote for a person like that, because you know that person is very unlikely going to bring you. Kind of look after you, the voter. That person's going to look after him or herself. So do vote for people who are humble and who are not flashy and bling people, and so on. It is very important. And then maybe the last one is vote for people who follow the rules of society. Yes. You know, and so on. People who are actually examples as citizens, and people who you would trust with your little child if you have a child, or and so those type of people. It is very, very important, because if people are going to vote still based on the past, based on color, based on singing, based on rhetoric, based on people blaming other people who are violent, they're going to get all of those. They're going to get violence back. They're going to get unemployment back. They're going to get potholes back. They're going to get water outages back, and they're going to get service delivery back, a lack of service delivery back to them.
Yeah, I mean, I say to people that your vote for, because a lot of people don't understand local government elections. In fact, a lot of people don't actually understand elections properly, but that's a story for another day. Yeah. I say to them that when you vote local, those are the things you're going to notice immediately in life. When you vote national, those are the things you may or may not notice in 5 years. Yeah. But yeah, it's the things that happen almost immediately. I just want to thank you for your time. You've been absolutely incredible interview. I know with absolute surety that you're one of South Africa's favorite South Africans at the moment. You truly are beloved by quite a big portion of South Africa. You'd be surprised how many people know of you. And when I've mentioned your name, how many people have been excited that you're going to be on the show. You're really quite a big name. And I hope that you do more interviews in more spaces. I hope that your son makes you do more Twitter posts more regularly, because you really are a wise elder of South Africa. You really have a lot of calm, rational, common sense to dispense to everyone. So thank you very much for joining us on the show. I really look forward to dealing more with you in the future. This is the much loved Professor William Gumede. We have executive producer Ben Matjiu. I'm Aidan Brown, and this is the Main Stage podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and bye for now.